As noble citizens, we must bypass a life of dormancy and vice to pursue the generative endeavor of a hard day's work. The benefits of these pursuits are not secured by chance or charity, but through the merit of your character and the firmness of your convictions. It is you who are planting the seeds of trees whose shade you know you shall never see.
Welcome to a very, very special episode of the Broken Wind podcast, the Hell on the Beach series. We're doing maybe episode 1, maybe episode 0. We're talking about Florida. And neither of us are qualified historians. We're going to be leaning heavily upon the book Finding Florida by T.D. Allman, which we're here with super producer Vane, if you want to say hello to.
Hey.
I think he would highly recommend this book.
Great read.
Yeah, dude, right? It's a great book.
Yeah, Butler recommended it to me, and I couldn't recommend it enough. If you like the series, definitely get yourself a copy of Finding Florida.
Shouts out to T.D.
And all
Allman.
the credit to T.D. Allman. Hell yeah.
Yeah, and you know, the thing with this is, like, Florida's a place, we're going to try to tell the story of Florida. For people who may have been listening, you may have seen this coming. We've teased this quite a bit. Florida's a fascinating place for so many reasons. And part of it, I think, is just a sort of eternal recurrence. And I'll say, I'm a Floridian here. I was born in Florida. And
native.
Something about Florida is there's a real nativism. Thank you for using that word.
Florida man.
Yeah, there's a real nativism to Florida and to a lot of parts of the United States. Massachusetts being another place. New York has a huge nativism. And that's not unique to America either. It's just a sort of like a thing where being from a place comes with certain privileges and advantages. And it also comes with a certain history and stigma, even depending on the place. Florida is almost seen as the background, evil escape place for so many people. It's the retirement plan for so many Americans too. It is this it exists in sort of the background of so many conversations of so many people, and it's all yet the epicenter of so many important political parts of the discussions of this world. I have just a few written down here. Epstein and Trump. Just the fact that the current presidency
Mar-a-Lago
is so central, right? Is so central in Florida. They have Alligator Alcatraz, just for, not to date us too much, but they're building concentration camps in Florida. The Florida.
You can date this all you want.
Right. Well, Florida too, underappreciated part of the Civil War, and that's something we'll return to. But I think one of the most stark facts I use to highlight that is that the governor of the Confederate governor of Florida, who killed himself because he was so sad about the Confederacy. His son, named Jefferson Davis Milton, went on to be the first member of the Border Patrol. And this is a fact I don't ever have to look up because it's memorized. It's not secretive. It's something there, it's well known if you're anyone who runs in these kinds of circles. At the end of the day, it's the American conflict for the global South is something you can understand through Florida too. There's a lot of narratives that move through the state of Florida, the history of Spanish colonialism, and it's all just a lot of eternal recurrence too. To give you a personal anecdote as a Floridian, in my line of work, there's a very large Spanish company investing what I think is an ungodly sum of money into a prospect that may never be profitable. And I, on a regular basis, have to listen to other native Floridians complain about all of the, overabundance of people moving here from other parts of the country, oftentimes other parts of the world. So, not to minimize the indigenous Holocaust that was very much perpetrated by the federal government of the United States in Florida, and we'll get into that.
As we will go through extensively.
Oh, yeah. But it is a keystone piece of understanding America, in the same way that understanding the Northeast is, in the same way that understanding, anywhere throughout the Mountain West, and understanding go west, young man, California, all of those are important parts.
Right.
But I think Florida, going back to the 16th century, has sort of a special role in what it is to be American, what it means to be a native here, especially as a white European person.
Yeah, it's so interesting that we learn in this book that we see the roots, essentially. Even the first flag of the Confederate emerges really in the Patriot Wars of Florida.
Yes.
before we start going out west, young man.
The Lone Star started in Florida.
Yeah, Manifest Destiny has its roots in Florida, and it's the first state that we attempt to grasp outside of the 13 colonies, which is so important for understanding the history of America, which is really what we want to do in this series, is to tell the story of America by telling the story of Florida, and not the story that many have wanted to tell about Florida, but the real story there underneath the surface that has been buried. There's layers and layers of sedimentary myths, essentially, that have been laid on top of Florida.
Right.
And underneath that, we really can uncover the history of America and the first attempts to grasp beyond the 13 colonies.
Right. Florida, very well put. I'm glad you brought up the Patriot War, too. I want to underscore that that is the true origins, according to T.D. Allman at least, of the Lone Star flag for Texas and, Puerto Rico and, other parts of the Caribbean, too.
Stars and bars.
Caribbean history is American history, and it's where I think American history meets a lot of the rest of world history in some very ugly, unflattering ways that don't get really, I think, their day in the sun often enough. And I think that because places like Puerto Rico and Haiti, which we're not going to get into quite as much, but the Dominican too, all have a very rich, complicated, and similar history to Florida.
Yeah.
They're very much parts of the same puzzle, and the segmentation between all these places as remnants of the history that we're going to be talking about here. It is very prescient. None of this stuff ever went away.
Right.
And we're going to be telling a story with a lot of ugly, cowardly, monstrous behavior, people betraying each other in ways that will make you unhappy to hear, But it's a very compelling reality about what America is. And there's an abundance of evidence of it now because, as I said, it's it never stopped being relevant at all. It's we have so much connective tissue. Andrew Jackson being Donald Trump's, guiding guy.
Favorite president, famously.
It says so much. Yeah. And Andrew Jackson's conquests of Florida are something we'll be getting into as well. But, one point I want to make, too, before we go too far is just that, one layer we're going to really cover a little bit too is the way in which this is all a part of a grander colonial conquest of the North American continent, and Florida is a place where you see the sort of connective tissue between the Southern American continent and the Northern American continent, that power dynamic playing out to this day. And we'll cover what that means in the politics of the Caribbean, in the now and in the past. And the mythology of the Northeast as it plays out into the Caribbean too is also important. I think a lot about Plymouth Rock, because we're going to be talking about later in the rest of this episode. We're going to talk a lot about mythology. Florida is a place of incoherent and overly dense and internally contradictory mythology that is constantly upon scrutiny is just obviously a facade of some kind.
I'm glad you brought up Plymouth Rock, because I don't know if you remember, but I spent time in my life living in Plymouth in high school. Didn't grow up there, but do remember learning about the Rock and a lot of the mythology that we're going to get into later in the series, what gets established by the Union of the Daughters of the Confederate, for example, these monuments that get built very much remind me of the Rock, that they point to trees that never existed, that were clearly never planted at the time of Ponce de Leon, and say that this is where Ponce de Leon landed, similar to the Rock, which we learned even in high school, a completely fabricated myth. The rock that's there is not the rock. And you wonder, why does the state bother to tell these stories and to invest money essentially through national parks and things like this to tell what is an inaccurate version of history? And if you peel the layers back, it's not so innocent, really.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought up national parks too, because there's even something we might not cover as much, but that's a thing when you talk about the relationship between the global north and the global south, is charity and national parks as a means of sort of like neocolonialism too is like, I think that's something you can see almost pioneered in Florida too in its own way, that like a lot of it's about like using the land and like all of this like productivity or like I don't know, that's its own like complex argument that's played out throughout a lot of the rest of the country within various indigenous communities. And it, like we want to make sure to hold space for that too. Like we're going to be talking about basically a genocide here. Like that's going to be like the main thrust of the kind of story we're telling, is like the genocide of a place that had people when the Europeans arrived, and then a lot of those people died, and they didn't all die though.
And to tie in the story that you had brought up earlier of a modern example of someone sinking a lot of money in Florida. That's ultimately another part of this story that we're going to tell, that Allman points out in the book Finding Florida, is that Florida is a state where dreams of turning conquest into a material profit or a surplus go to die, and nobody is able to actually, even successful conquistadors are unable to tackle Florida and to turn it into what their vision is supposed to be. And you get the sense that people today are very much out of place when we think about things like climate change and the reality that much of the state is built on only semi-permanent land. And there's a feeling amongst the conquistadors and the people that settled there, essentially, that they're not the ones that are out of place and that they're the ones who are natural, belonging to Florida. But in the grand scheme, Florida can easily have other plans. And that's, I think, a key theme within the book, that people are unable to bend Florida to their will, and that ultimately Florida is this pervasive place of contradiction that really does have a passive aggressive way of getting its will at the end of the day.
That's so cool that comes. See, I feel like that to me is so like also kind of like how, I don't know, it's hard to explain. Like, as I said, as being someone like born down here, it is like a place that is so crazy. And I actually wanted to, before we'll get into the book soon, but I want to say two things, or I want to sort of take two detours. First is like, T.D. Allman's book is very good. There are a few critiques I have and will have as you get there. There's some like very strange slavery apologia he'll do that's like about like a multiracial slave owning family that was like good inside. It's like one of those things, like Florida's got a lot of gray area stories, and he tells one of those in a way that I don't agree with. But then
I know the one you're referring to.
Dude, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, to dovetail it though,
starts with a Z.
He also makes a assertion about like alluvial soil or something like that. It's so funny. Like when you read the bad reviews of this book, that's one of the things that someone was like, he got the alluvial soil thing wrong. And it's like, it makes me laugh because it's like, okay, well, there's a lot else in there that's like your top.
And even if he got that one specific part wrong, it doesn't get the general theory wrong.
There's a lot of other.
The inequality of land, the inequality of the distribution in Florida is the key part.
The way the land
it doesn't really matter. It's really that, as we'll talk about, there's a ridge that runs through Florida along the Atlantic coast that's almost like a spine that runs above sea level, as well as the region of Tallahassee, I believe, which has always been used as a strip of great land that's exceptionally good compared to the rest of the state. And as we'll talk about throughout these series, and hopefully in future series as we do material analysis of places, hopefully we will discuss this kind of material conflict that arises in places such as Italy, Spain, Russia, places that have a massive territory. And Florida is one of them, where it's got built-in contradiction,
it's also
directly built into the territory, and regardless of whether or not alluvial soil is the reason why one patch of land happens to be this way or that, really doesn't change the greater point, which is that the state is so inherently contradictory, such as being mostly underwater, except for one part, the spine that is almost one of the most rigid parts of the tectonic plates, it's unaffected by tectonic activity, unaffected by volcanoes. So even though we know that Florida is sinking underwater, there's also a part of it that will always remain, and that is remain above water even. Well, and so while it's changing, it's always going to be there to some extent. And that in itself makes Florida a land of contradiction that's going to breed political contradiction.
I want to make the second detour about the geography of Florida, absolutely, because it's a very unique and interesting place, and it's one of those things that's like part of why everyone has such a complicated relationship with Florida. Is that it's not like anywhere else in the continental United States in any way, and there's actually not many places in the world like Florida, because it's essentially this gigantic aquifer too. That big spine you're describing filters salt out of the water, and it's not good water, but it's like you can dig
it's
down.
It's like a sponge.
Yeah, you can dig down anywhere in Florida and get to like fresh water fairly easily, which is pretty crazy as a quality for a place to have.
Yeah.
And like
and it's made of almost all limestone, unlike the other Sunbelt states like California, which should be very similar and yet is very different. And as we'll talk about a lot, obviously California had the gold rush because there's a lot of minerals there, and Florida has virtually no minerals whatsoever and is only limestone.
I have no idea where I heard this. I think it was from my mother, who's a big geology head, and I could be wrong too. I'd love to be fact checked on this by anyone. But the story I've heard is that Florida was actually a large chunk when Earth was, had all these plates that were one big plate called Pangea, and as it spread out to the various continents we have now, Florida was a part of the plate that became Africa today that stuck to the bottom part of North America. That's my understanding of it, and it was essentially this gigantic coral reef that extended out of the bottom of the United States for a very long time. And it's this giant sandy bar. It's like the world's largest sandbar for that reason. And that's why, like, as you said the word, like, we talked about, like, the way the land is used a little bit earlier. It's like, that's the essential, like, contradiction. As someone who's lived in Florida for many, many parts of my life, it is somewhere where the way the land is used is a constant, like, glaring question about everyday existence, because it's a big place, but it's also not, and the cars dominate everything. The urbanism, Florida is not a place that naturally deals well with urbanism, and there's a sort of, like, I think, angst that it creates amongst anyone who lives there, where despite their politics, they do find themselves being somewhat of an environmentalist out of just, like, survival. Because, like, as you said, the place is sinking, and, people live in a lot of very low places, very close to the ocean. That's actually not that unusual in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of places in Florida that are well above sea level and will be for probably another century at the end of the day, as much as, like, global warming is terrible. The entire world's, like, island cultures face many of the same problems that they face in Florida, particularly giant crazy storms. And that's the other thing about Florida's geography that is so fascinating, is it's a place that regularly is just ravaged by hurricanes, and that's just a part of, like, how all of the ecology understands this. And when you live in a place like Florida, it's like the things that thrive at the end of the day thrive in conditions of pretty regular, like, 8 to 10 hour exposure of, like, UV-12 light, which is radiation that will cook lots of things and faster and worse than you would expect, including your fucking skin. And then also intense rain and wind. So, like, tough, leathery plants. Same for the lizards. That's why we got crocodiles. It's
the Gulf Stream, too.
And I want to make this other point before we move on about the ecology, too, because you said, like, there was no minerals they could use at the time when they showed up because they were looking for gold in the Fountain of Youth. But what they learned over time was that they had an incredible amount of phosphorus, which is what you get from all of those decayed coral skeletons. And that is something that is essential for any compost or any kind of supplement for plants. And it's for this reason that Florida is almost like this gigantic...
Some plants grow very well there.
Yeah, a lot of plants do. Florida is almost like this gigantic hydroponic grow box where ultimately, like, you can grow almost anything here. Will it grow well?
Right.
No.
Maybe. And some things will grow incredibly well. And we'll talk about this first chapter is called Invasive Species.
Yeah,
and we're going to talk about how...
Hit it.
Thanks. Yeah, we're going to talk about how ultimately, I believe he says at some point that maybe 9 out of 10 things won't really thrive there. And many things that are known in Florida, such as the mandarin orange, many things came from other places, which Florida becomes very well known for, such as growing its oranges. Those came from China originally. And the conquistadors attempted to plant all these different things all over the place in this experimental phase as they're exploring all over the world. They first bring corn up and attempt to grow it in Florida, and many things that hadn't been grown in Florida are first grown. And at the same time, you have invasive species such as the pig that dominates eventually the whole North American continent, and species are brought back ultimately. And we're going to talk, I think, a little bit more about this part in our following episode when we get into chapter 3 and 4, which talk about really the early origins of the state. I think this episode we're going to talk about the founding myths, essentially, of Florida and stuff like Ponce de Leon and the Fountain of Youth and things like that.
I wanted to say, too, that, like, if you want to understand erasure, as, like, when people talk about erasure in terms of, like, genocide and, like, identities, what happens to, like, people who are genocided within a society, it's like, look at the modern Floridian identity, which is, again, a total fabrication of constructed elements that just, were either plastered on in spite of their, ability to survive in Florida. Like a lot of the landscaping of like grass, is not really a Florida thing, but, citrus does do well in Florida. But, the actual like indigenous culture is much more embedded in the history of the islands, I would say. I think one thing that I would say is worth pointing out too is that like the Floridian genocide was being a lot more complex too by the time that like America was integrating into their culture. It was still like kind of more thorough in a lot of ways as like a displacement of people throughout the country. Like they were just removed from this place, and there are like that identity of like Seminole, what that meant, which was also very complex by the time that even was, going on. That's something that has been paraded around by various high school teams in Florida for better part of a century, like centuries, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how long. Well, I don't know when the first racist high school team was in Florida. That's hard to pin down, I guess, but maybe the 19th.
We'll get you that later in the series when we've discovered that.
Yeah, we're going to get into the chapters now. So
yeah, I think one of the things, too, to point out as we were talking about the contradictions of Florida is how it's situated between two different climates, essentially. It's not quite temperate like the Northeast and also not quite tropical. You can't grow many things like you can in the tropics, like bananas, although the Spanish tried.
Yeah, and if you've never driven from like a very southern part of Florida to a northern part of Florida, it is truly like moving between an entirely different climate in a relatively short period of time. It's very interesting, and I'm sure, we've all experienced that to varying degrees.
Yeah, right. As we're talking about the inequalities of the state, you can have such a massive change in the quality of the fertile from one place to another in what we consider Florida, and you can have a massive climate change. You can have a massive altitude change. And then another part, I think, of, as you were talking about the sunlight, I think a good metaphor as we start to get into this myth is really just thinking about how sunlight really is the best disinfectant. And there are these so many myths that have started really in Florida. And these were imposed by people who wanted to impose their will on the state of Florida and on the history of Florida and to tell their own version of it.
The history of the country, too.
Yeah. And as time passes, Florida is going to be one of the places that has a mind of its own and reveals, nope, actually, the version of history you want to be telling, I'm not going to necessarily let you tell. I'm not going to let you deny climate change. I'm not going to let you tell the version of history that this place wasn't set up with all these forts around here that had to be used to fight off the native people. And because the region was so hostile that people couldn't live there without actually building fortresses, essentially, to fight off the natives.
Yeah.
And that's a history that they don't want to tell, that they want to point to a tree or a rock and tell you some other story that's a distraction, really, from the true story of how Florida got to be the way it is.
And I've had discussions with people who have other backgrounds and identities about this, and part of it, I think, is that there were different attitudes and different cultural approaches to the indigenous peoples of this nation, whether North America, South America, there were differences, and the English were more genocidal in a lot of ways, and not that the Spanish were good. They were horrible too, and also extremely genocidal. Same for the Portuguese, but it's all very different stories, and the British and the French get in there too in Florida. Florida is just such a cluster of all of these elements coming together. And I always like to joke too that being born in Florida, they just give you a real estate license because Florida real estate has been sought after and mapped since
from the very
16th
beginning.
Century. And and I think that's something we want
Ponce de Leon.
That's a good starting place. Yeah,
absolutely.
We can talk about the Ponce himself. Ponce de Leon, this fucking guy. And let's say, once again, just holding space, too, for how awful these guys are.
Yeah.
Ponce de Leon and all of his, assorted cohort were such prolific rapists on average. It's the fucking ways in which these guys approach Native American peoples and women. It's fucking insanely monstrous. I'm reading other books on the subject now, but get me into the factuals a little bit too, because walk me through it, Mr. Vane here. What do you got?
Yeah, let's start off where the book starts. The book starts with the imagery of, if you're driving down the intersection of Ponce de Leon and Matanzas Boulevard. And these are two very common names, and there's an intersection really of ideas there also.
Yeah.
So I think it's a nice place to start off. It's obviously why he chose to start there, as the provocative imagery of these two ideas. So who is Ponce de Leon? Most people think of Ponce de Leon as the story of the discovery of the Fountain of Youth and the statues and the monuments in Florida, which have been built to celebrate this total fabrication. And then
it's basically settler colonial myth. It is, and it's not even one that was really fabricated by the Spanish necessarily. It's not to spoil this chapter, but it's a settler colonial myth. That's what it is.
Yeah. So the intersection of Ponce de Leon Boulevard and Matanzas Avenue. Most people still don't know today that this Latin American sounding name Matanzas actually means massacre or slaughter, which means that the Matanzas Bay could be called Slaughter Bay.
I can give you some more context on that word, actually.
Yeah, do it.
Yeah, there's more context on that, actually, because it's an Italian word that specifically has, a Sicilian context for a time of year where they corral fish through certain, small channels and just catch a bunch of them at once, and it's a real, bloody spectacle. And
Slaughter
that's
Bay.
Something that the Italian Floridian connection is one that T.D. Allman laughs at in this book, and I think that the ecology is extremely different. Certainly, Italy's a prettier, better place in a lot of ways, but I think that culturally, socioeconomically, in their really fraught relationship to a state, to being a part of a state and being it's very interesting. And Italy has gotten a better deal in a lot of ways, I would say, than Florida as a place, but that always depends on who you are too. So yeah, so Matanzas is slaughter. Yeah,
and so in ye old English, there's a sign that reads the Fountain of Youth, and the sign glows and sputters like a vacancy sign on a state highway motel, which is very much like Florida, that it's this neon sign that's been built, which is completely unnatural, telling the story of the Fountain of Youth, which never really happened. And it says, this is the very spot where Ponce de Leon landed in St. Augustine in 1513, searching for a fountain of youth. The local ruler welcomed the Spanish as guests. And it says the Spanish were impressed with the beauty and strengths of the natives, and they asked the Timucua to tell them the source of their physical vigor. The natives pointed to the spring. And so that's where this myth originated that ultimately gets carried through men like Washington Irving, who have a political agenda in the history that they want to tell. He has his nephew, Theodore Irving, tell the history, and he promotes that he should really take his own liberties with it, just as Washington Irving had done himself with texts such as, it was a multi-volume work that he claimed he was going to translate himself by one of the early...
Oh my God, I reread that right before we were recording. It's so funny that his literally just like, this is too hard. This is
he basically was like, you know what, actually, this is a lot of work. What I'm going to do is slap my own name on it, take my own liberties with this thing, and really make it interesting. And so
that's awesome.
He puts his own American spin on it, very much, and becomes one of the first truly best-selling American authors, goes on to win a Pulitzer Prize. And ultimately, the myth of the Ponce de Leon searching for the Fountain of Youth becomes the myth that's cemented into people's minds. And in the early 20th century, I think it's the 1920s, that the state actually builds these monuments. So it's very late that they construct these monuments.
Well, before we get too much further, too, there's one point I always love to underscore. It's when I've been thinking about it a lot lately, living in these parts, is that the European colonizers were literally mapping and lusting after Florida specifically from the 16th century on, basically. And then they didn't have AC until the 19th century, which is crazy. But that is crazy. From 1501, their map is the first part of the New World, quote unquote, that's observed and mapped, actually. And it's I think often an underappreciated fact about Florida, that it's one of the most continuous perpetual European colonial settlements, effectively.
Wow.
I try and think of a more holistic way to characterize it, but it's kind of hard to, honestly, at the end of the day, because it's the thing about Florida too, I guess that's not to get too far off of the point, but we'll get back to Washington Irving stuff. Is it is a fucking beautiful place. And the monuments.
Oh, definitely.
Besides the shitty monuments, of which there are many, it's a crazy place. And
a beautiful place for other reasons than what they say.
Yeah. Right. It's never what you expect or want it to be. And it's not a place that does urbanism, right? It's not a place that does big, tall skyscrapers very well necessarily, but it can. And it could be a lot better, too. And it's something that I often am sad about. But the monuments are certainly not to dox myself, but I live in one of many Florida towns that were founded by someone who was an ex-Confederate and I think also was in the Patriot Wars. So it's this stuff is just very personal in a lot of ways. So yeah. And I don't know if this is getting too far ahead, but I'll save the specifics more so, but Florida had its own specific period of independence, almost quasi-independence, not dissimilar from America's break from the colonial powers of England, but it was under different circumstances.
Yeah,
and it was
similar to Texas.
Subsumed.
The Lone Star State.
Yes, exactly. So, spit some more on Washington Irving.
So Washington Irving, as I was saying before, he told everyone that he was going to take on this huge work of translating the Spanish archivist Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo. And he ultimately decides that he's not going to do that because it's such a grand undertaking and it's boring. So here's a quote from towards the end of the first chapter, believe it or not. It turns out that the person most responsible for spreading the myth of Ponce and the Fountain of Youth was none other than Washington Irving, the inventor of also Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Though today Washington Irving is remembered for his fiction, in his own time he was infamous for the liberties he took with the facts, in this case those found in the Spanish archives. No contemporary account mentions any quest for eternal youth by Ponce or any other of the conquistadors, but in 1535, some 14 years after Ponce died, the Spanish archivist Oviedo, without mentioning any fountain, remarked in passing that Ponce was searching for a remedy for
Inflacquicimento del sexo.
Inflacquicimento del sexo. More than half a century after Ponce's death, in 1575, a second unsubstantiated reference to Ponce appeared in a compendium of fact and fantasy dealing with an entirely different person. This one did mention a fountain. A third volume, published in 1610, nearly 100 years after Ponce supposedly discovered Florida, conflated this largely fictional and unrelated adventure with the history of Ponce de Leon's actual career, while mixing in other irrelevant and fantastical details. That was it. 3 baseless passing references to Ponce de Leon over a period of nearly 300 years until Washington Irving turned up in Spain in the 1820s. There, the brilliant American storyteller began what he promised would be an accurate translation of Oviedo's immense opus, which filled dozens of volumes. But Washington Irving was far too inventive to be anyone's interpreter. Finding his undertaking tedious as well as gargantuan, Irving turned his translation into a far briefer work, dealing only with Pizarro, Cortez, and Ponce de Leon, who are 3 conquistadors. Then, when he got back to America, he published what he had written under his own name, not Oviedo's. Irving, one of America's first best-selling authors, understood the importance of comic relief. Taking Ponce's supposed inflacquicimento at his starting point, he begun out a tale that is still as entertaining and deceiving as it was when he first wrote it.
And that 300 years that he mentioned there, from the 15th century to the 1820s when Washington Irving does this, it's like, that is more or less the period we're going to try and like suss out here, because...
Yeah, exactly. That's what this chapter is.
This is a project of like erasure. Well, like I said, it's like, there's so much about Florida that is about erasure that we're going to try and like, we're going to sift through the sand and try and like tell you a story about this place with T.D. Allman's help.
Yeah, and the story that you can see, what's so interesting here is it's so clearly constructed in this juvenile way, the same way that boys would pretend to follow the trail of Ponce de Leon or D.B. Cooper and imagine that they could put together the trail, even though serious historians and contemporaries at the time note that these conquistadors were not bringing instruments of measurement with them. What they were doing was going out at the time and venturing, much like later what CIA agents will do, shooting from the hip. This is how they like to operate. They didn't like to write down the stuff that they were doing. They improvised, and this is what the explorer mindset also became of these wealthy, like English explorers and stuff like that, a great tradition of that. I should say great, ironically.
A really great womp womp. Give it a womp 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 there. Yeah.
This tradition of explorers conquering places and improvising and doing whatever the they feel like as they do it. And that kind of happened with these explorers long before they even reached Florida. We'll talk about how...
Well, I was going to say, too, that, like, I think that Florida has always been, like, this land of fantasy and this land of, like, fantasy falling short of reality. And it's this land of, like, the effects of colonialism reflecting inward. And,
Yes.
the Cadiz Mutiny, something important we'll talk about later, again, is something that was literally like Spanish soldiers in Spain going, I do not want to fucking sail all the way to fucking Florida, to swampy-ass, shitty-ass Florida. And that's, like, something that, like, changed the world. And, like, the fact that Disney is in Florida is something that will come up again, too. It's something that, again, is when we say, like, this is the background place of so many people's consciousness. Yeah. Disney is an important part of this. And that's not just like
of building myth on top of reality. And it's a place where they put fictional characters above real people and buried the history of the real people.
That's what I was going to say. Right, like the labor conditions of Disney are known throughout the third world. And the impact of Disney, like, globally, I think is underappreciated. Like, I feel like it's always, like, trips me up when I realize that actually manga and anime was a response to Disney. It wasn't, like, something that, like, that all came out of people, like, seeing what Walt Disney and stuff were doing and seeing, like, that was something they wanted to try. There was obviously a history of, like, drawing and art and animation and things like that before that to some level, but a lot of, like, modern manga heavily influenced by Disney. And as I said too, like dovetailing off what you said, like, labor conditions in Disney World are notorious for being dog shit and, like, a panopticon employer like no other. So, it's like it's the kind of thing where it's all stuff that affects my day-to-day life here. Where were we? I think we're good on chapter 1, honestly.
No, I think there's more on chapter 1. If we circle back, let's talk a little bit about the age of the conquistadors. And so there's the myth of who first sees Florida, and it's believed that it's Ponce de Leon. And of course, this isn't true. The reality is that thousands of Europeans saw Florida before Ponce de Leon ever discovered it. Mm-hmm. Of course, Ponce de Leon does arrive there, but it's a later voyage than the first one. The very first is likely either a Portuguese or an Italian man. Some think that it's Giovanni Caboto or John Cabot, as he's better remembered, an Italian who first discovered Newfoundland in 1497. And he was not trying to find a fountain of youth. He was trying to find a passage to China and potentially gold or other resources, but mainly looking for a passage to China. Finding that, quote, there was no appearance of passage, he tacked about and ran south as far as Florida. Here, his provisions failing, he resolved to return to England, according to a history of the U.S. published in 1830.
Right.
The first repeat visitors to Florida become the Spaniards, and they start trying to, as I alluded to earlier, they try to kidnap and enslave people and try to find resources and plant resources there. They're trying to establish the first, basically, dominion there, and at the same time in this kind of experimental phase of, like, seeing what happens when you move people from one location to another. Then they don't have any ability to. This is the disturbing part about slavery, is you need to estrange a person, bring them to, like, an island where they have no ability to live on their own.
Right.
And this we'll talk about becomes a key part of the genocide that we'll talk about in later episodes of the Native Americans, which takes place in Florida, a process of removing the Indians, concentrating them so that they can't survive, and replacing them with Africans for labor who are estranged to the land and don't know how to survive on their own. And that's a key part.
Right. Capitalism requires a group of people being displaced at all fucking times. And, like, that's unfortunately also, like, a lot of the colonizers' stories in some ways, too. It's just they showed up and started, like, fucking trading in human beings from Africa and doing awful things and treating them in these awful ways. And that's something that all across America, North and South, was, like, a major factor.
And so we can see a lot of parallels to this time period of the early conquistadors to the time period we have, honestly, at any period since then under capitalism,
where
really the adults send their children out to venture, and this is why we call them business ventures.
Venture capitalists,
Venture capitalism. That, you're sending the youth out to conquer.
These like warrior heads.
Yeah, and it's no surprise then that they have these multiple names, that they have these elegant families that give them 13 fucking hyphenated names in a row. Mm-hmm. That's not on accident. It's a pattern. Yeah, that these guys are the ones that have the big ass ships. They're the children of influence.
Feral hogs. They're feral fucking hogs.
Yeah, and they're being sent now to experiment in this way. Hey, see what happens if you take people from the continent and transplant them to the island. Yeah. See if they become good workers. See if you can take the fruit from this place and move it over here. And so there's this very naive, experimental. At the time, they're thinking of this as the height of civilization. Yeah, but obviously, looking back, this is a very crude, early experimental phase of first discovering in Europe, like, oh, hey, look at what happens when we plant a fruit from South America in Florida and just see what happens. There's not very much intelligence going on behind it, arguably.
Yeah, it's a very destructive phase because of the way
exactly.
It looks like
not much forethought. There's not really much forethought into what might happen, even though they're celebrating these as massive advancements. Not too much forethought, massive destruction of ecosystems that we'll talk about comes back ultimately to bite the Spanish, because the Spanish aren't planning on all the natives dying as they come to the New World. They want to enslave them, and then as they're dying, it's hurting their chance of profits.
I gotta make this point. Like, we've talked about this on the show about social violence and about how, like, the idea of being displaced leads to an inherent, like, sort of violence that whether you die or not, you're probably going to die sooner. Your life's probably going to be shittier. Like, even just voluntarily moving across an ocean is difficult under, like, modern circumstances. And it's like it was shitty for anyone. It's shitty for anyone ever. It's a form of, like, violence that, whether imposed violently at gunpoint or self-imposed, has a net negative effect on a person. And the latter is much worse, the one at gunpoint.
Yeah, and these are people who are under the pressure cooker, similar to us today, of having the common stripped away from them and all these things that they used to be able to rely on, such as the idea that you could just pick a fruit and that there's no established idea of private property that's widespread. Well, this is now being implemented at the barrel of a gun, essentially.
Yes.
And so people are now having to come to terms with this. And now that is causing people to search for new land, this demand for new surplus, because austerity essentially is happening in Europe.
And I want to say too that, like, displacement as a Floridian is, like, always just kind of like a fact of life that's kind of like built into the history of this place and built into the way that, like, people move away from here. No one wants to live here. People live here and then fall out of love with it, or they're just here for the summer and all that kind of stuff. And that's the modern iteration of that. But there's, like, this constant sense of, like, anything can be uprooted and moved away at any time and completely replaced with something else, and the erosion that's inherent to that has destroyed this place that is still, to this day, so incredibly naturally abundant that it attracts forms of life that are not able to sustain themselves this way in, like, almost anywhere else in, like, the America, at least. And the way in which, like, birds use this as, like, a way station between North and South America, butterflies too, that's a part about Florida that doesn't always get appreciated, is that, like, Florida specifically is a place where, like, butterflies and flowers do extremely well, and butterflies use Florida as a migratory point through, like, from Mexico to the rest of the continental U.S. and, like, other parts of South America. So it's, like, just this, like, natural wonderland that has been infested with feral hogs and other kinds of monstrosities.
Yeah, and as this section is called in the book, invasive species, and invasive species do very well.
We're on chapter 2 now.
I don't think we're quite on chapter 2 yet. We're still working our way through chapter 1. We'll try to pick up the pace, but I think we're talking about the Spanish and their attempts to establish Florida first. They're the first who make repeated attempts. And even Ponce came into proof that there was contact even with the Spaniards before him, as he encounters native inhabitants who already speak Spanish. And the greatest proof of earlier contact is that they're already hostile to him wherever they land. And a quote is, in all his attempts to explore the country, he met with resolute and implacable hostility. He was disappointed also in the hopes of finding gold. And then, as we've said, others had discovered Florida before. We have several maps beforehand, like the Juan de la Cosa map, which was published in 1500, the Waldseemüller map in 1507,
Right.
which is today housed in the Library of Congress.
Early 16th century. It's so
Early
crazy to think
16th
about.
century shows the peninsula really projecting off of the New World in a very clear way anyone could recognize. The most famous is the Peter Martyr map, which circulated in Europe in 1511, 2 years before Ponce supposedly made his discovery. So if there's anyone we know who actually deserves specific credit for having been the first to reach Florida, it was probably the Portuguese navigator Gaspar Corte Real. He first sailed to America via the North Atlantic route in 1500, makes 2 more voyages in 1501 and 1502, and on his 3rd time, his luck runs out and he disappears with the ship. One of the ships does return safely. Yeah. One of the ships does return safely. This is decades before the official discoveries. Sailors ranging from cod fishermen to pirates would have ventured into North American waters deliberately or because their ships would have been blown off course and mapped the coasts as they sailed along them. So many people would have sailed here before it was mapped. So in all likelihood, thousands of people had visited before Ponce de Leon, though he represents one of a class of people, as we're saying, the people with the many names,
Right.
who are the sons of these people who are taught navigation, which is a highly educated upbringing. And they're brought up in the context of increasing indignance due to debt and the imposition of debt being imposed on everybody in Europe, essentially austerity and the destruction of the commons. So Florida's destiny clearly was shaped by forces both north and south. There's the attempts by the Portuguese and the Spanish and the French all to grab Florida from all directions.
British too?
British as well.
Not as much, but yeah.
Not quite as much, but yeah. So the reason that the Portuguese ultimately don't really try to grab Florida too much, although, as we said, likely they may have been the first who actually set sight on it, the Portuguese explorers, because it was in the context of this time period where only Spain and Portugal are capable of, as we would say today, projecting naval influence around the world. And so these are the 2 seafaring nations that are exploring, raising children, naming them with 13 hyphenated names, and they're going out. They have a connection to Italy, and they're asking the Pope, and that's a key part.
Yes.
And people cynically today understand that none of this could have happened without the permission of the Pope or the modern states of the day.
Yeah, there are some shockingly old Catholic churches in Florida. There are some shockingly old churches overall. But.
Yeah, and we'll find the parallels of that run through with the U.S. presidents as well, that you don't have these attempts to grab the land without the state ultimately encouraging it on the one hand and turning a blind eye to it on the other hand. And it's a well-known scandal that the royalty were essentially allowing these conquistadors and pirates to go out and grab as much gold as possible and turning a blind eye to them, even though this wasn't really a very Christian thing to do. And ultimately, the Vatican was influenced by the treasures that they would bring back, and everybody knows that. And so there's the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is the reason why the Portuguese never really make much attempts to, because in this time period early on where it's just the Portuguese and the Spanish attempting to colonize the New World, This Treaty of Tordesillas is a vertical line drawn that the Pope has decided anything west would be Spain's and anything to the east would be Portugal. So anything new and undiscovered belongs to Spain. That means that Brazil ultimately goes to Portugal and much of South America, which at first proves to be the better end of the deal. But as more of the North American continent is explored and the West is explored, Portugal starts to find that this is a deal they don't like, and they renegotiate it with this 370 leagues provision. And this ultimately gives Portugal a bit more land of the New World, but Spain still is getting the better end of the deal, and it still leaves Portugal dissatisfied and leaves Spain with much of the New World, although this compromise won't really work in the long run, and it proves not to, as the Protestant nations will not be bound by the word of the Pope in the long run.
Right.
And so they're the ones who come out later, like Britain and the Dutch. They end up being much more aggressive because they're no longer bound at all by the Pope. So once they have the capability of navigating, this compromise is essentially null and void because Protestants wouldn't listen to the Vatican anyway. So it's only a short window of time, really, that Portugal and Spain get a monopoly on this new territory. And it really should be described as a monopoly because it was literally called a patent. So much as we say, these are early business ventures, only Spanish conquistadors were given patents to explore the new territory, and the Portuguese were not. And ultimately, that's why they make very little attempt early on to try to grab Florida, while Spain settles there by de facto, essentially, through listening to the Treaty of Tordesillas.
Well, I want to take one more step of like scene setting too, and this is kind of a tangent, but it's something I learned about fairly recently that kind of blew my mind and kind of like slotted a lot of things into place about the kind of world that these people are discovering, with big, air quotes, like the kind of place they are coming into, what kind of like truly like utopian, beautiful, like majestic wilderness unlike anywhere else in the world. And we've talked about Florida, but I want like the region they're in of like Louisiana, Mississippi, all that like swampy area that flows into Florida, much like, a lot of the water from throughout a lot of the rest of the U.S. had a big feature in it that I, like I said, learned about very recently called the Great Raft, which was basically a gigantic log jam that kind of raised the water level throughout the entire region of Mississippi, Louisiana, parts of Texas, well into the Florida Panhandle. And that like swampy feature was so densely packed and almost treated like this like trade route throughout the region, because it stopped all the waterways, but also was like something you could ride your horse on, according to some reports. And there's this very like desert swamp feel to a lot of the region I'm describing nowadays. If you've ever been there, you might know what I mean. And when I learned this, it kind of like put it all into perspective, because one of the first things of Western settlement was not just to like get to California, but also to get rid of this giant fucking log jam, which then caused all of this water to recede, and all of these little, like towns that had built their whole livelihood off of their little lake or whatever to just completely die off and to become a lot drier. So, it's a tangential point, but it's like this is the world they're
It gets us back on track, actually.
Yeah.
That actually brings me to the name of Florida, which is something we didn't talk about much. Yeah. And I think we'll be able to round this chapter out pretty quickly after that. So the chapter talks about where the name of Florida came from, and Florida means flowery, or flower.
Right.
Which is interesting because Florida is not natively a flowery state. It's really more of a leafy state.
Yes, that's true.
And so that in itself is interesting. And the reason the name Florida was chosen was because of Ponce de Leon. Here's a quote from chapter 1 on how the name Florida was chosen. By March 1513, when Ponce and his private flotilla of 3 ships sailed north to claim the new land, there was no need to discover Florida. Ponce's expedition was meant to address a quite different question: how to secure, settle, and finance the administration of this new land that had fallen within Spain's ambit. Conferring an official name on such a place was an important ritual, akin to baptizing a new land. But why Florida? It was not because of any profusion of flowers. Look into any Florida backyard, even today, you'll see a somber palette of greens. Leafiness, not floweriness, is the hallmark of Florida's vegetation. What flowers you see are mostly imports. The significance of the name was religious. It was a custom among conquistadors to name places according to the dates of the liturgical calendar. Columbus discovered the island of Trinidad on the Feast of Trinity, hence the island's name. Pascua, Florida, was a poetic name for Palm Sunday. By the time Ponce went ashore in early April 1513, Palm Sunday, which fell on March 20th that year, already had passed. But when it came to names, his choices were often fanciful and sometimes macabre. He called the Florida Keys the Martyrs because, poking out of the sea one after another, they reminded him of the decapitated heads of Christians who had died for their faith. Yeah, and so that was Ponce's creativity when it came to coming up with names, the same guy who named Florida. Ponce's own log of the voyage establishes the place where he first landed on the Atlantic shore of Florida. It was probably south of Cape Canaveral, which was more than 100 miles south of the future site of St. Augustine. And I do want to now finally round out, I think, the chapter with the story of Ponce, how he meets his ending. So I'm going to give that background that you asked for earlier on Ponce. Right. But I think it does tie
Ponce.
Oh, is it Ponce de Leon?
I think it's just Ponce. Yeah, it's just Ponce de Leon.
Ponce de Leon. I've been wrong all this time.
It's okay.
I've been wrong about everything. I was wrong about Florida for so long.
Dude, that's what this is about. It's a process.
That's what it's all about. We're all undoing what we've been taught the wrong way, and I was taught it was Ponce. Probably by myself. I don't think anyone gave me this misinformation.
Kind of tangential to this point, though, is that, like, I do genuinely feel sometimes that, like, there's a lot of, like, weird internal bigotries within fascism and imperialism that are an important part of what keep it moving. And I think that, like, part of that is, like, the colonizer and, like, the colonial subject and their biases. And then also, like, the American disgust at what's going on in Florida is, I think, its own sort of, like, weird ancestor of this, like, neo-colonial creation of a country.
Yeah, and they talk about how we're getting a lot of this info, too. Much of this is written down by translators. One of them, I'm drawing a blank on the name of, but I believe it's in this chapter that we learn much of this information, which was archived by a mixed race person who was quite literally the product of colonization, was both part of the conquistadors as he's taught to write and to record the history of his own people being conquered. And so there's this built-in contradiction of the only people that could have actually known both languages were essentially people of mixed race, and this is playing out over such a long time period that we don't think about the fact that there were many generations going on between the period that we sort of blur together in our minds of the discovery of Ponce de Leon, and that's a theme that runs throughout this early chapter, that the history of Florida tries to tell it that these different conquistadors are ultimately interchangeable. And that's why I want to get to the painting, which T.D. Allman says is more truthful than libraries worth of books. And it really reveals it.
Words.
Yeah, pictures are worth 1,000 words. And this painting really tells a deep truth about Florida.
Jamie, what's the name of that painting?
The Joe Rogan Experience.
What's interesting about the name of it is that it gets changed because the author of it, Moran is the last name, is basically trying to sell the painting to the government. And this is a period of U.S. history that's pretty interesting. This guy, Moran, he's an artist and also a businessman. It kind of reminds me of Charles Ives. He's a musician who is an entrepreneur who I think was pretty similar in terms of he was pretty conniving, savvy businessman, I suppose, recognizing an opportunity to sell art to the government is really how you can make money for sure as an artist. And so the name that he originally calls this painting, which depicts a very leafy landscape, about 70% of it is all leaf, no flowers, which is an honest painting. And that's why this painting is not very successful.
The trees behind him really strike me too, because we barely have trees like that left.
Yeah.
Like some regions of Florida had some trees, like redwood-sized trees. People think it's crazy to think, but there are photos of people cutting down trees that were like you could never even fit your arm around, or maybe I could take a few people, like we'll put the photo up in like this episode description or something, or the
right.
painting, but if we have the rights, I don't know if that's legal, but it's a great painting.
I think this painting's public commons. I'm definitely going to share it so you can see. And it was renamed to Ponce de Leon in Florida because there was already a DeSoto painting that Congress had paid for. And so he changed the name to Ponce de Leon in Florida and tried to sell it. Found no purchaser. And
so funny.
Ultimately, it lives a funny fate, which T.D. Allman says is very much like how Ponce de Leon spends the rest of his life. So it says, Moran's painting reflected the reality that once ashore in Florida, names no longer mattered.
Yeah.
All the conquistadors were interchangeable figures lost in the enveloping green. Finally, nearly 20 years after Moran finished it, one of the Ponce de Leon Hotel's interior decorators bought the painting because its name went with the new hotel. Then, the painting disappeared, only to reappear episodically, just as DeSoto had himself, in the most outlandish places. It would be displayed in an Oklahoma City used furniture store before finding its way back to Florida. Today, it is on display in Jacksonville's Cummer Museum.
Wow.
In the end, all that remained of DeSoto's immense wealth were 2 slaves, 3 horse, and 700 wine. All were auctioned off to the survivors of the expedition and their camp followers. The winners agreed to pay for their purchases with Florida's non-existent gold, the money to be paid by the purchaser on the first discovery of any gold or silver mines. Hernando de Soto had become to pigs what Johnny Appleseed would be to apple orchards. 500,000 feral hogs causing problems in Florida, a story dateline Gainesville, Florida announced in August 2005, more than 450 years after DeSoto's swine began their first proliferation. European pigs arrived in the country with some of the earliest settlers, and they either escaped or were released into the wild nearly 500 years ago, another report examined. Since then, they have migrated as far north as Canada and into at least 35 states. The conquest continues. In 2012, the National Feral Swine Mapping System showed that the beasts had colonized much of Oregon and almost the totality of California except for Los Angeles and a few other freeway-enclosed safety zones. But they feel especially home at Florida, one news report noted. And that's the end of chapter 2. I think, as we kind of did with the last one,
there's one.
If you're okay, we can circle back here because we ended up at the end of the chapter. I'm kind of glad we're not just going perfectly linearly through the book. I hope that that's more interesting to the reader anyway.
Yeah.
I did want to talk about DeSoto as a figure.
Well, and there's a line from the start of the chapter I wanted to read actually about DeSoto because I think it's excellent writing by T.D. Allman. And it invites a larger discussion about like what I mean by the eternal recurrence of Florida too. Is like all of these guys, as we mentioned already, ad nauseum, really, are like people of extreme privilege. It's like to be a Spanish conquistador required a level of generational wealth that few people had.
And they never knew failure anywhere.
I mean, they did in Florida.
Until they came to Florida, exactly.
Right. That's the cool thing about this place.
That's an interesting part.
Everyone runs up against reality in Florida. And De Soto, so one of the line from the end of the first paragraph in chapter 2 is that De Soto is the first of the Protean super rich who, having triumphed everywhere else, ruined themselves in Florida. And I think that really is like very much, it's like Florida is a place that denies accumulation and the kind of like expressions of hyperaccumulation that are appreciated elsewhere, just by nature of the very like geology and geography. Like it's just, you can't build things the same way here, you can't do things the same way, but things can live here too, like with the fucking pigs.
You can't conquer it the same way,
but at the
which
same
is
time,
what a lot of these guys
can. That's what makes them crazy. It's like the pigs you just mentioned are doing great. It's like if you want to come out here and be a fucking pig farmer, then like there you go. But it's like that's not what these guys are coming here to do. So that is, the margins on that aren't good for them. That's why they had to do human beings.
Yeah, so here's a quote from the book about De Soto's credentials right after that part, actually.
Yeah.
De Soto seemed ideally qualified to succeed where others failed. Before arriving in Florida, he had saved Pizarro's empire in Peru for him, then returned to Spain with a fortune in melted down gold and silver that made him one of Europe's richest men. Deciding Florida, and this is a man who was born not incredibly rich. He was born of the poor, and on Columbus's voyage, which De Soto is believed to have been a young boy on, he's not incredibly wealthy, but within 14 years later, his ventures with Columbus and his actions while he's out there, which I would say is his ruthlessness, his sheer ruthlessness for a coin, is what he proved out there, willingness to do anything to make cash. And that is what, within 14 years of his first voyage with Columbus, allows him, he's given a patent to take over Florida, and Florida becomes his land to conquer, essentially. And so he arrives, again from that quote I said, so he said, deciding Florida would be his new Peru and his alone, De Soto landed on the west coast of Florida in 1539, a stranger to failure. Then, in the course of 3 years of futile wandering, he destroyed his fortune, his expedition, his reputation, and himself. Even more than Ponce's, his subsequent transmogrification from marauding killer into gallant protagonist epitomizes the persistent denial of the tragic element in the accounts of Florida's past. And so De Soto arrived with 9 ships and more than 600 men. This was 80 years before the Mayflower would set sail with only 101 men. He came questing gold in the shortcut to China, and in 42, having exhausted his men, his supplies, and his physical and mental capacities, De Soto died on the banks of a river which may or may not have been the Mississippi.
Right, which is why I brought up the Great Raft earlier, too, is that, like, we're talking about a region that Florida is not the only part of and was not even really understood as, like, a distinct part of for a very long time for reasons that made more sense at the time, too. It's like, I feel like we've got a lot of good points out of chapter 2, and I don't know what else.
I want to talk about how De Soto dies. It says...
That is funny. These guys always die in the funniest ways. Give me a womp 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 of De Soto's death. I love that.
Also, it's important to note the river story. He dies by a river, and Washington Irving's nephew, Theo Irving, decides to say that he discovered the Mississippi River, completely conjuring this fact up out of nowhere. And... shortly before that, he'd been saying that he himself had discovered the river, and then just decided to change that, and that it was more interesting to say that in fact De Soto had discovered the river, which was again a complete fabrication, just like his uncle had done.
To kind of summarize the first two chapters too, it feels like what Allman really nails is these two really like critical fabrication, like these just examples of what are not the only examples, but just like really good examples of the kind of like bullshittery that is literally endemic to the story of Florida, with Washington Irving's interpretation of Ponce de Leon, and then this shit with the Moran painting.
Yeah, and you have a whole cabin industry emerge embodied by this guy named Henry Schoolcraft, who's these people who pretend that they have replicated the path of De Soto, even though one of the archivists, Gomez Suarez, who called himself the Inca in order to emphasize that he was not a full-blooded Spaniard, but was actually half Incan, as I was talking about before. This is the guy I was talking about, who is himself half conquered and half conqueror and has to live in that contradiction. He's one of the ones who wrote down about his own conquering, and he said that no path could be discerned from De Soto's own methodology, and that he didn't bring his own tools to measure the path they took. They truly were just improvising and participating in a bloodbath.
I don't know why.
Yeah, and so that didn't stop people more than 300 years later saying that they actually could reconstruct the path based on Spanish writings, which they could not read.
Yeah.
Which is, again, like children do, pretending that they're following the path of D.B. Cooper, which is okay when you're a child, but it's bizarre for a state to be building monuments to this kind of fantasy. Yeah, so I think also I skipped over the death of De Soto. De Soto basically dies.
I'm literally doing that thing where I mix them up in my head now thanks to this painting too. It's so funny, dude. It's like just being so cooked from the internet, but it's like, yeah, it's like I said, it's like the like half-baked like laziness of these people is so...
The laziness of just acting like they're totally interchangeable.
It's so Floridian. It's
yeah,
just
we should
so,
also talk
like,
about...
foundational.
Yeah, and they talk about these two monuments that really reveal the scope of the fabrication. They say...
Oh, the ones in Tampa. Yeah. The De Soto monuments, yeah.
Two monuments erected in Tampa area illustrate the scope of the fabrication. On a sweltering day in May of 1539, Hernando de Soto and an army of over 600 soldiers splashed ashore in the Tampa Bay area, kids are falsely taught, when they visit the De Soto National Memorial, a federally funded facility located in an attractive waterfront area where Hernando de Soto is no more likely to have splashed ashore than in faraway Yellowstone. Smokey the Bear is likely to have put out a forest fire. Staffers of the National Park Service give their young visitors the chance to try on a piece of armor, just like De Soto never wore. At the other monument in downtown Tampa, De Soto is transmuted into a kind of gentleman Florida ladies in hoop skirts would be right proud to welcome to their garden parties. The De Soto oak plaque, as it is called, marks the tree under which tradition says De Soto parlayed with the Indians. According to Floyd E. Boone's guide, Florida Historical Markers and Sites. But this tree could not possibly have been there when De Soto commenced his policy of kidnapping and enslaving whatever Indians he could find. Looking at the De Soto oak plaque, you can almost see the tail of William Penn and the treaty elm taking off its plain Quaker garb, putting on a conquistador's plumes, and then, like so many Pennsylvanians later, moving down to Florida.
Yep.
And they talk about, too, the use of De Soto's name in the early age of automobiles with Chrysler De Soto. Chrysler's first car name was the Plymouth, which was meant to obviously create connotations of the first Thanksgiving and Plymouth, and it was meant to be marketed towards Americans, essentially. And so they wanted to know what they should name the other car, which was marketed at a more upscale market. I'll take a quote from the book. Names of explorers were popular because Americans themselves now could explore their country from sea to shining sea. The competition already had appropriated Cadillac, but the name of another, by now acceptably non-controversial explorer, was still in the public domain. De Soto had covered more North American territory than any other explorer, notes Dave Dursey in his 2005 essay on the legendary gas guzzler. The first De Soto, spelled with a capital D, no space between the words, was the 1929 model, America's best-selling car, the year of the great stock market crash. The De Soto became America's car of the moment again in 1957, when its chrome-encrusted tail fins made it the automotive epitome of the Cold War consumer society.
Well, you mentioned the sort of class distinction there of okay, we're called Cadillac De Soto, but we want to have a classier thing, and we're gonna go with Plymouth, which is a part of Massachusetts, and that's one of the sort of themes. There's a few themes we're gonna get at here that are maybe a little different from what T.D. Allman has to try and expand on, and it's that sense of colonial grievance between places that have essentially the same political economic story in a lot of ways, but one just sort of overtook the other is a lot more of the relationship than it seems. That is interesting to me, and I think this endless cycle of grievance around nothing that you see amongst right-wingers in the U.S., it all traces back to these sort of weird projections of oh, it's nicer to live here, nicer to live there, where it's there's just different ways of living in all of these places. And I don't know if you want to round this out. I think we've done a good amount of time here. There's one more point I want to put in for sure to sort of round things out. There's obviously, from what we've been saying here, a proud tradition of people lazily pretending to know what they're talking about when it comes to Florida, right? We're here to contribute to that. We're here to give it our best college try.
Just adding to the broken wind.
To be, amateur experts on Florida, put a little broken wind twist on it, take you to the beach, and there's going to be pirates, there's going to be mafia, there's going to be fucking Confederates, and we're going to talk about the nature of borders and crime and all of these things and colonialism. And
bad faith politicians.
Bad f***ing faith and lying and conquest.
And people who sink their entire fortunes into Florida, much like De Soto, only to get stuck with a poison arrow and to die a miserable death.
Yep.
Where
colonialism reflecting inward. It's the little place where that all happens on the North American continent. And, I'll save my closing thoughts for the end of the series, but thank you for listening this far. If you have, we really appreciate it. It's going to be a good time. We're going to talk more chapters throughout the next series. We might just get to one at a time because they get pretty dense. But it's a lot of history in the state of Florida, and we're going to keep it as contained and structured as possible. But we appreciate any questions, feedback, and criticism. Because as I said, it's neither of us speak Spanish, neither of us really can deign to be experts on any of this, but we want to also tell these stories to spaces where they maybe don't get into quite as thoroughly, because I think they're very misunderstood, and as we talked about, deliberately misrepresented by lazy shits who are still venerated in a lot of ways. So
thanks, Washington Irving.
Yeah, I know. Cool guy. And then, let's get him one last womp womp for Ponce de Leon and De Soto.
Yeah, and I did want to talk about Ponce de Leon's death. This summarizes how most people come to Florida expecting it to be one way and end up eating shit. So, Ponce reached the Gulf Coast of Florida with 200 men and some women, along with 50 horses, all crowded into 2 ships. Once again, he went nowhere near St. Augustine. Instead, he made the mistake of landing on the Gulf Coast at the same place where, 8 years earlier, he had been attacked. The logistics do not seem particularly arduous, but to get an idea of the difficulties, someday at Florida Marina, try to get 1 horse on and off a cabin cruiser. Now try it with 50 horses while Calusa warriors shoot arrows made of sharpened fish bone that have the projectile velocity of Major League Baseballs and the penetrating power of Swiss Army knives. Ponce de Leon's thigh wound might not have been fatal, but infection flourished in the subtropical damp and dirt, and the Spaniards were as indifferent to the sepsis as they were alert to heresy.
Right.
The wounded Florida land speculator was med-evacuated to Florida.
To Cuba.
There he suffered a slow death of gangrene and fever. Ponce de Leon expired in the all-penetrating damp of the Caribbean summer in July 1521.
I missed out on the first part of that quote. I'm so glad you read that, because it's like, yeah, Florida, still exactly the same in so many ways.
It's where people go to eat shit.
It's the place where, like, geography defines history, and just like many places that's true, but it's, like, so evident in a place like this, and that's just one of those instances. Like, it's a dangerous fucking place. It really is. You can't treat it the same way.
There was one other part earlier. Hopefully, we might end up having to add it later, but I think we've done pretty great.
No, I think that was good. Let's sign it off here.
Well, that's all the time we have left for part 1 of the Florida series. We hope you've enjoyed this so far. We're making this episode available for free on all major streaming services, but then future episodes will likely only be available on the Patreon. If you want to get access to future episodes of the Florida series, make sure you subscribe to our Patreon maxed out deal. That's $5 a month, and that's going to get you access to everything that we create, including our forbidden courses and also this long-form Florida series and future long-form history series that we're going to do like this one. You're also going to get access to the news updates as soon as possible, and you're going to get all the unedited content. If you like the episode, please comment, please subscribe, please share it with your friends. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and stay tuned for future episodes.